hopefully be patient, but I think that at least if your signal's strong, Alan, it will carry me through when my signal dies out. I'm Bobby Lopez, your usual host. This is the show where we give people a hard time who need to be given a hard time, just like Socrates' horse. And as guests, we have Capstone Report, the editor, Alan Atchison. And we want to continue with what we were talking about yesterday about pro-fraud Christians. That's what I'm going to call them. These Christians who are very vehemently condemning other Christians who are standing up to election fraud, using this term Christian nationalism. And we want to talk about what are all the implications of that. So first, I want to introduce Alan. And Alan, if you could tell me give me your assessment of the last 72 hours on Christian Twitter and where this term Christian nationalism came from. Why are we seeing that term everywhere?
Well, I think you have to look at, first of all, that's a great question. What's the origin? And generally, it's come out of these progressives. There was a very anti-Christian, anti-conservative evangelical book written not long ago, The Power Worshippers, and it's all about the evils of Christian nationalism. And basically what that means is any conservative Christian who thinks that Christianity ought to have some influence over government policy. So there's that type of, I think that's the genesis of where it comes from. And it should disturb us that these big evangelical elites are using this term now, because it shows where they're getting their information, their news, who's kind of feeding them their worldview. And there are countless of examples where they're retweeting the New York Times or the Washington Post or other highly leftist secular sources. And so when they use Christian nationalism, the term is very vague, but I think in general what they're doing is they're using leftist terminologies here, and we ought to be aware of that. But the two terms themselves, I think let's look at that. Is there anything wrong with nationalism? I don't think there is, and I don't think there's anything wrong with Christianity influencing the nation. In fact, I think Christian influence on nationalism, on the nation, will kind of temper it, because it'll make us all realize that rising out of our shared humanity, the God-given rights to all of us we have of self-determination, I think Christian nationalism isn't a bad thing. But the way these big evangelical elites are doing it, they're defining it in a very negative way that comes right out of the leftist playbook.
All right, so you're kind of hitting upon what my suspicion was, which was that they're using the term Christian nationalism as a synonym for white nationalism, as a synonym for Nazism. And this began where I went over 8 people who tweeted about Christian nationalism within a period of a couple of hours. Obviously, Beth Moore got a lot of attention, but I see Eric Erickson, all these other people that are all kind of hitting the same note. Let's talk about the biblical argument for this. Yesterday we went over this a little bit. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. First of all, I want to make clear that the Bible is a political book. There are a lot of parts of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, that do deal with how believers, how followers of the Lord have to deal with political situations. You find that not only in Proverbs, also in the Psalms. You find that in the entire history of the monarchy, in the book of Judges, in the prophets. Then in the New Testament, the book of Acts of the Apostles, obviously, Paul deals with his status as a Roman citizen, and he uses that in ways to try to advance the gospel. And the book of Revelation is a very political book. It describes these empires that rise and use the political power that they have to force on people. So there's no biblical basis for saying that in order to believe in Jesus Christ, in order to be obedient to God, you have to completely withdraw from the political sphere. This is an argument that people had during Nazi Germany and after Nazi Germany, because there were pietists who said that it was wrong to even resist the Nazis, because you had to just accept that God had sent this political realm on there. Does this sound right to you, Alan? And can you think of any historical examples where this debate has come up before and what we learned from them?
Well, I think there are several things there, and it's very perceptive what you've mentioned about the Bible does have it's not a political handbook per se, but it is certainly a guide to politics. It should influence how we think about politics. And I think what you've mentioned there about how people are trying to force Christians to accept the status quo in politics, be it a dictatorship or the excesses of modern secular democracy under the idea that it's God's will. I think Eric Erickson tweeted out something that was just inane, where he said that if you're a Christian, you really don't believe Christianity if you're not going to accept Joe Biden as your president. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Joe Biden's election is a political act. Does Erickson really mean that every political act is God's will? So Roe v. Wade was a political act. So if we resist Roe v. Wade, according to Erickson's logic, we're going to be resisting the will of God. Therefore, we're sinning. Come on, that's absolutely insane.
Well, at the very least, it is totally at odds with the Old Testament, where you had good kings. You had Josiah, you have Asa, you have Hezekiah, then you have kings that were lousy, like Ahab and Rehoboam. There's other. So it does not make any sense to me that you would think that every single person who obtains political power, no matter how, is therefore operating with the full moral authority of God. That's like the divine right of kings, which I know that you want to talk about this, and I do want to go to that. I want to talk about the whole tradition of the divine right of kings in early modern Europe, and I don't know why anybody would think that that's biblical to retread that ground, especially given the fact that we're in the United States, which is a country that founded itself against that entire reading of divine right. What do you think?
Well, I think that's very important. People who want to apply this idea of submission, first of all, they're misapplying Romans 13. Submission in the Greek there doesn't mean exactly complete submission. C.B. Cranfield, the excellent New Testament scholar who wrote a superb 2-volume commentary on Romans, talks about the Greek there, and its uses in other places of the New Testament. It uses the same word in terms of marriage, and part of his point is it's a word of mutual obligation, not just unquestioned obedience. So when you kind of understand mutual obligation, which more fits, I think, the ancient Near Eastern and Roman period, and even early modern Europe view of governance, there's almost a contract. I think social contract predated, the Enlightenment in some ways, because everyone understood you had obligations as subject and sovereign. Of course, the Enlightenment expanded that a little bit, but I think certainly America, when we get to America, sovereignty is not invested in a person. It's invested in the people. We, the people, do ordain and establish. So when we understand that, we reserve to in ourselves the ultimate sovereignty in the republic. Not even the law is superior really to the individual rights of the person. The Constitution recognizes rights. It doesn't grant rights. These precede and come out of our human nature that God gave us. So understanding this, when somebody says you have to submit, what are you submitting to? And in the U.S., sovereignty resides with people, ultimately the people. So we all have and reserved a little bit of our own authority to kind of consider the actions of government. And, we can withdraw our consent at some point if government becomes destructive of its key purposes and God-ordained purposes. We're not called to blind obedience.
Right. And I think also the issue with Romans 13, first of all, the Greek word exousia, in my mind, that refers very specifically to the type of legal authority that existed in Paul's time. Rome had a very established legal process, or don't want to use the word established, but they had a very deliberate legal structure. And so if you followed the process, at least you could say that you followed the process. And that's what Paul did. Paul chose not to accept this clemency from the people in Jerusalem because he wanted to go to the emperor to bring his case. He wanted to use the legal mechanisms that were available to him. And that makes sense. It doesn't mean that anybody who obtains power all of a sudden has your complete obedience, or you are the same thing as disobeying God. And also in that passage from Romans 13, remember that Paul says that God places the authorities there for good, not to evil, which you can interpret as that scholar did and many other people have, that that's how you discern the authorities that this applies to and it doesn't. If there's an authority that is forcing you to do evil, that is not source of evil. You know what I'm saying? And so that would make sense.
Right. I think that's very important because there are two points there that you raised that I think are exactly right. We are bound to obey the duly constituted authority. So not anyone who comes up to us bearing a sword and says, "Hey, I'm Caesar," gets our unquestioned obedience. There needs to be some level of legitimation of that claim. Uh, Now, there are general processes of that, but in the U.S., it's a little different than antiquity. Classical antiquity, even in early modern Europe, there was a laid out plan of succession and a way to change the succession. Today, we have elections, but just as in previous historical eras, if there are questions about the legitimacy of that election, we have every right to say, hold on, we're not ready yet to crown a new sovereign. We need to make sure. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's perfectly within our right as citizen kings, because in a way, I think that's a really good way to view ourselves since we've retained sovereignty in the individual people. But you talked about historical examples. This misuse of Romans 13, I think, is an old trick. And it brought to mind, and it has over the last few months, the way that evangelical elites go. It's brought to mind Winston Churchill's writing in his biography of the 4-volume biography of the Duke of Marlborough. He wrote about James II and James II's attempt to subvert the Church of England to reestablish Roman Catholicism. Well, James II was exploiting the doctrine of the Anglican Church, which was the non-resistance to royal will. And so he attempted to say, well, you can't oppose anything I say because it's in church doctrine, that you have to just go along. Well, surprise, surprise, the Church of England didn't want to commit suicide. They didn't want to return to the Inquisition, and they disobeyed. So this, I think, is an old trick. And because people of that era, Christian leaders of that era, had a backbone, like Eric Metaxas has today and other Christian leaders have today, they stood up. And when they stood up in England, in the reign of James II, it led to the Glorious Revolution. And I think there's a lesson there. People will pursue anti-Christian agendas using the language of the church. Pay very close attention to the people who are telling you you must absolutely accept a pro-abortion president who wants to make you pay for it. Pay attention to that. It says a great deal about their priorities, who they are, what they're serving. And their ultimate goal and their ultimate loyalty is not to the church. It's not. You can tell. They're over and over insulting the people who pay their salaries and who have elevated them to leadership, whether it's in the Southern Baptist Convention or people who write columns for big magazines who've traded on the reputation of being a Christian, or they're female preachers or Bible teachers that make a lot of money for Lifeway. They want to smear the average conservative, and they're not friends of the church or the average Christian. They want to impress one audience, and that's the coastal elite.
Right. You know, it's funny because one thing that came into my mind, and this is going to be a really risky thing to say, but I can't stop thinking about Nietzsche, because I've always believed that Nietzsche there was a shred of truth to what he was saying. If you think that he's criticizing the false Christianity, not real Christianity, but he's criticizing this Christianity that wanted to turn its own weaknesses into virtue, and that try to take away human beings' strength and their will by making it seem as though you're godly by being weak. And that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from all of these people complaining about Christian nationalism. And I can't judge what's in their hearts. I can't judge what's in Beth Moore's heart or Rod Dreher or David French, or any of these people. If they're doing this out of fear, because they are afraid, they're afraid of having to stand up to so much pressure then I don't see how there's any biblical basis to it whatsoever. The Bible does not tell us to be fearful. It tells us the opposite. It says, don't.
All right. I think, can you hear me? We had a little bit of a choppiness there. I can't hear you. I see you now, though.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry about
I got
that. The internet does this. It's I don't know if it's the deep state, because they always seem to cut in right when we're on the good conversations.
It was an
But all right,
important point.
why don't you respond to what I said earlier?
Well, I only heard part of that, but I think you've hit on something very early in that before you cut off. You were talking about these guys turning weakness into virtue. There's an important point there. There is a softness and in the character of the leadership today of the church that mirrors the softness in the culture. Anything that is manly is viewed as bad, and anything that is sort of feminine is viewed as a virtue. And so they don't want you standing up for your rights because that's dangerous. But there's a lot of really good literature from the American Revolutionary era where you can read the sermons of pastors, and it's outstanding to read men that were willing to stand up and call out cowards when they wouldn't stand up for the liberties of the people. And they would deliver wonderful sermons. There are a couple of really good books out on that for people who are interested. I've written a couple of reviews on Capstone Report, and I highly recommend them because they're great reading for right now, particularly when you realize that, as Eric Metaxas said the other day, it is a time to stand up and be counted and to fight for what's right.
Yeah, I guess that's the part that's always hard. I'm trying to get into the mentality that they're giving us about how Christian nationalism is wrong. I keep on concluding that they think that you can't worship Christ and care about your own country at the same time. It's almost like if you live in Sodom, you should just let everything go to pot and you let your family be destroyed instead of going out and defending the men from the crowd outside the door. It's not logical, and it's certainly not biblical. This is the thing that really gets me, is for people who really, they pound their chest and they talk about how they're coming from a biblical place and how Christian Trump supporters are wrong because they're idolatrous. I mean, this accusation of idolatry is a serious slander, I think. And their own position does not have any biblical basis. And
Right.
I don't understand why no one calls them out on that,
Well, this was something that I've written about a long time ago, particularly when it came back and touched the immigration issue maybe 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Nations are a key building block of God's created order. He established them. There's a reason. He didn't want a global empire. Go back to Babel. There's a biblical story there where God scatters people. In Acts, Paul talks about creating the extents of the sovereignties that are on the earth. He fixed their boundaries. So nations are part of God's plan. So it seems to me these globalist Christians, these supranationalists, actually are the ones that have the burden. They're the ones that are creating an idolatrous view of a utopia that can be created here on earth by trashing nations. God gave us nations. He told us that we're supposed to be good citizens of the nations and the places he puts us.
Right.
So if they're trying to dissolve that responsibility of the citizen for a Christian, I think they have a very high burden. And in fact, I don't think they can meet that, because where do you rest your loyalty? They sure love to talk about helping the city, but anything about America or the nation state is anathema to them.
Well, and hopefully the internet won't die on me when I bring up critical race theory. We'll see if it freezes. But this is one of the reasons, one of the concerns I have about critical race theory. I have all long felt that critical race theory actually displaces multicultural literature and history, that it teaches people a bunch of generalizations, it gives them frameworks to think about things, it reduces everything to these very simplistic binaries of power, and it doesn't actually teach people the facts of the way things went. And so, for instance, when they're sitting here talking about how we have to passively accept what God has given us, if Biden is the next president, we have to just passively accept that and not be part of it. They're quoting in some cases the very passages that were misquoted to justify slavery, like Ephesians. Slaves, obey your masters. When Samuel Sewall, when he wrote the first anti-slavery tract in English in the year 1700, he went after all of those specific quotes, and he explained why you can't use that to justify a status quo where people's rights are being taken away. And so I think the lack of racial history is really starting to undermine what a lot of these people are saying. When they're saying that there's no evidence and they're rejecting witness testimony, they don't understand that they're going back to an earlier time. There wasn't a time when Black people, their testimony was by policy not accepted in court. They could not submit a testimony. Most of the slave narratives that you see, if you look in the back, there's all these authenticating documents, because legally a white person had to say that what they said was true, that their testimony was not received as evidence. And so for people now, if it's, I don't know, Eric Erickson, or whether it's one of these other people who are attacking Trump supporting Christians, for them to say that Trump supporters have no evidence, they're basically saying that a group of people who have given 1,000 affidavits of testimony don't count as evidence, and they don't understand historically what they are retreading. Because if they knew the history of this, I don't think that they would want to go back down that road. The same way that many of them, David French, for instance, was applauding the fact that Texas had its brief rejected. And that was based on the 14th Amendment. That was based on equal protection under the law. That was based on the very ugly racial history where there was a time in America where some states said, we can pass laws that effectively make it almost impossible for Black people to vote. But because our system is going to require a poll tax or a literacy test or some kind of counting beans in a jar, but we'd only ask the Black people to do it. And the Supreme Court basically said that principle no longer applies, that now states can apply whatever kind of crazy voting standards they want, and no one can say a darn thing about it. And so it seems to me that there's a huge failure because of critical race theory being brought into these Christian institutions, because I do think that's where the ignorance comes from. I think it comes from the fact that they replace what would have been important historical information with instead this critical race theory, which I think actually makes people much more ignorant about what's going on. How else can you explain the fact that all of these Christian leaders are applauding these legal decisions that are they're horrifying to me, because we're setting civil rights back so far.
I think there is a historical ignorance on the part of a lot of people who are Christian leaders right now, but that sort of mirrors the general problem in the greater population. And people like Russell Moore come along and will use these types of things to kind of exploit a biblical ignorance to replace some truths and some good instincts that we have with some falsehoods, because it sounds really good and simple. So I do think you're right in terms of the embrace of critical race theory, that people have simplified and focused on things that aren't necessarily history, grievances instead. And in touching on the Texas decision, I think you're right. That strikes it very much at the Constitution.
Yeah.
States
history. That's equal protection under the law.
And states should have the right to sue one another when it is over a political matter. It seems to me that the state has standing to sue another one over violation of the Constitution.
Yeah,
If you can't, then what's the point of the Constitution? How do you enforce it?
Right. I mean, J.D. Greer has forced us to listen to all of this racial discussion, and then he misses this. He retweets Matt Smethurst's thing from the Gospel Coalition, going along with the whole thing about how now we have to accept everything from Jesus. We can't fight to change the laws. We can't fight against injustice, which ultimately you can't have these two things simultaneously.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
they're trying to turn Christians into mindless slaves.
right,
And that fits the leftist progressive agenda. It's really shocking. The
right.
Gospel Coalition would want to make people mindless automatons to the state. I'm shocked because it sure seems like that's what they're constantly promoting. They
Right.
really are. I mean, they're the prophets of the Great Reset. They're here. They wanted it. They've been preparing the ground in the church for the last, I don't know, at least 10 years.
Right. And I think it's also just so crass because it seems to me that they knew that some of the most convincing evidence was going to be coming out now, and that a lot of authorities were going to be put in this difficult situation where there's no turning back from the electoral certification and the electoral vote. At the same time that now the public has access to so much evidence that it, like, for instance, that report that came out of Michigan about the computers, now it's an open and shut case that there was fraud and it was on a scale that throws into doubt the election. At the same time that all of the procedures have closed the doors on any kind of alteration of where we're going. And at this critical moment, what we see now is that these Christian leaders are actually, they seem to have been enlisted to get us to be quiet while we are forced through this completely contradictory moment in history where we've never seen a fraud that was this undeniable, at the same time that there's no constitutional provision left anymore to stop the coronation of this false presidency from going forward. And that's what I think is so crude. What is very disturbing to me is among the list of all of these Christian spokespeople who were attacking Trump supporters for being idolatrous, Christian nationalist, whatever, all that stuff, there were many professors. Karen Swallow Pryor is a professor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Denny Burke, Andrew Walker. Yeah, Andrew Walker. Bart Barber was a trustee at Southwestern Baptist Theological Society. People who are involved in education, who are tasked with providing civic education to young Christian leaders, are missing everything that we're talking about. It's going over their heads. And so we're in a state of complete, it's the part of the Bible that Jesus talked about, the blind leading the blind. I mean, they're both going to fall into the pit, right? I mean, have you seen any glimmers of hope, at least in the educational institutions, of anybody coming forward and pointing out these historical points?
Well, I think that you're going to have to look very hard in the Southern Baptist Convention seminaries right now. We have, as you know, a group of people who are basically pretend to be conservative in public and do nothing but promote woke thinking in private. And I think that's pretty much at all the seminaries. I mean, I don't know a lot about the West Coast, but certainly at most of them, there are a lot of examples that have been well documented. So I think the conservative professors tend to not last long or have to hide who they are and what they are. It's almost like secular academia right now, where you're sort of tolerated. You're sort of tolerated, maybe, if you don't say the wrong thing. So I'm very bearish on the seminaries and things like that getting anything good out of them right now, because it's very bad political theology. And some of this that comes out of I think the Southern Baptist Convention's oversimplified way they think about politics. But I think larger problem has been people like Al Mohler and his disciples, Russell Moore, have had for the last 10 plus years really an opportunity to pollute the waters and the thinkings and advance people who think like them, which have tended to embrace critical race theory or other types of highly problematic politics.
Well, and there certainly must be some level of identification, I think, between the Southern Baptist leaders and the corrupt behavior that we're seeing to get Biden in power. Because, a lot of the tactics that you're seeing, this manipulation of process, doing the crime right in front of you, and then putting you in a situation where procedurally nobody will correct it, and then tamping down on everyone's eyewitness accounts of it. I saw that at Southwestern. And this is like what's happening in the national election to me is exactly what happened when they removed Paige Patterson, when they fired all of us, when they did this to Roy Moore, when they did this, it's the same thing. The way J.D. Greer ends up being the president for a third term by canceling the election. And then anyone who complains about it, you're going to get kicked out of the Facebook groups that talk with among Baptists. I mean, I have friends that were kicked out of this one Facebook group. I think it's called the Baptist Review, because they were talking about my firing, and they're not allowed to talk. I mean, so it's the same thing. There's almost sort of like a mirroring. And I feel like the people in power in the Southern Baptist Convention, they have some identification with these abusive practices. So they just feel automatically drawn to defend them and to uphold them.
Well, I think there is a big problem in Southern Baptist circles. You talked about people getting kicked out of Facebook groups because they tell the truth. They talked about your case. There are fanboys. There are these people who are hero worshipers, and they defend and enforce that 11th commandment in the Southern Baptist life, and they're going to drive you away if you tell the truth. And you stood up for what was right, so they're not going to tolerate you or anybody talking about your case or whatever. So there is a very bad history in Southern Baptist circles of dealing with controversy or people who are controversial. So they try to marginalize, they try to call up pastors or people behind others' back and say, you need to get that person under control, kick them out of the church, whatever. It's just how they operate, because this is how they maintain control. So there is an affinity for this kind of strong arm tactic that we're seeing in amongst the mainstream media and other outlets of trying to silence anybody that raises a question and says, hold on just a second, is this fraud or not? And there's evidence out there. How good that evidence is, that's debatable. We can all sit back and say this is good, this is bad, whatever. But the fact that they don't even want to say that there is evidence, I think, is gaslighting us really significantly. And anybody who says that is obviously not trustworthy. They're a liar. And I think I've come to the realization probably in the last 6 months that there are more liars at the head of Southern Baptist Convention entities and organizations and churches than we know. The stories that we've had over the last couple of weeks on our website about Kevin Ezell using vulgar language about other Southern Baptist leaders because they stood up to him or they questioned his actions is highly disturbing. We know what's going on at the ERLC. They don't want anybody asking questions of them. They sent out a really petty letter to the executive committee because the executive committee sent them some emails saying, oh, wait a minute, that amicus brief you filed was false. It's got some really things that are demonstrably untrue about the SBC. We're concerned about that. So they fired back, the trustees fired back a letter saying that was insulting to the executive committee and everything wrong with the way the SBC does business. You can see right now that whistleblowing trustee that came out at Southern, there are a lot of examples going on here. And if people in the pews don't wake up, the SBC is going to be in real trouble coming up.
Well, the good news is I think that they are waking up. I've never seen this many evangelical conservatives woken up. That's the good news. Now we're about half an hour in, and I do want to just have some fun with history because you're one of my friends that I can talk about history with, which I love. Okay, so right now we're at a state. This is what everyone's talking about, where it looks like America is heading towards a split. We're going to become two countries at some point. I don't think that we can stay together as a country indefinitely. obviously the Bible has such a pertinent example in the split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And I think if we were to map our situation onto that, I'm going to say that the conservative states are Judah. All right. Just, obviously kind of a self-serving analysis. But obviously there are other examples of times when peoples were partitioned. You think of what happened in Germany after World War II. They became East and West Germany. You think of what happened in the English Civil War, which we were talking about earlier before we came on the air. What historical example would you look to and say, that's it? That's the kind of pattern that we're following. I don't think it's going to be like East and West Germany, but I think it might be like the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel at some point. I don't know. What do you think?
That's a really good kind of thing. And if it panned out that way, where people just amicably split, that's great. I'm far more worried that we're sitting in a time that's more like 1936 Spain, where it's really nasty and really brutal, and it's going to deteriorate into a very bad, violent situation. Another thing you can sort of think about Germany and during the Weimar years. I know that's not a partition, but think about, you got people duking it out on the street on a daily basis. You've got mobs that are out of control because the government is either ineffective, or in the case of modern America, democratic cities and mayors want the violence. So I think that's what kind of concerns me from an historical perspective. You've got, I don't think the leftists are going to let conservatives go. If it came to that point where we said we need to have a divorce, you go your way, we'll go our way, I just don't think they're going to let it happen because they want power. And I think that's ultimately what's driving a lot of this stuff. The elites think they're entitled to rule. And that's why they were so upset by the Trump election. That interrupted their right and the anointing of Hillary Clinton and more globalism. So I think anything like that is going to be met with strong resistance from our elites.
Right. One of the examples I used in a previous live stream was the fall of the Roman Empire, when the Eastern Empire continued on. And I still think that that's probably one of the most similar parallels, because it'll be a question of the blue states basically falling apart. It's not so much that we're going to have an amicable divorce, but they're just going to fall. I do think that the blue states will fall apart before we will. Before the red states will. I think that the blue states are more dysfunctional, even though they have more money, even though they have Wall Street and Hollywood and everything. They're going to have the riots. They're going to have the crazy COVID lockdowns. They're going to have the weird stuff going on in the schools. And I think that it might be that we will split apart just because their parts of the country are going to fall apart in 30 years and just not be functional.
That's a great example. And I like it for two reasons. And you talked about the decay. We're seeing that. Goldman Sachs is fleeing New York City. Other big investment banks, they're going to move to Florida, Palm Beach. They're going to live Fort Lauderdale. They're going to move a lot of office space and a lot of people out of New York City. You don't have to be in New York City anymore. Why? You can do most of this stuff anywhere. So we're going to watch the exodus. I mean, Tesla's moving to Texas. So you're going to see as much of these big money interests who are in some ways destroying blue states move to red states to enjoy the benefits that we offer. And then so I do like that analogy a little bit about the decline. But there's also one element in that history. Even though you sort of had the division between East and West, there was always a fight between East and West. And oftentimes a new emperor came up in Constantinople and was trying to reestablish his reign in the West. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes not. And I think depending upon what happens, I think there's going to be there's a groundwork for a struggle. And also too, we are in a geopolitical situation that's going to be kind of interesting. I mean, with the rise of China and all of these other things going on, how much outside interest is going to start tampering in the things that are happening in the U.S. Are they going to send more money to fuel this division, this violence that we see on the
Mhm.
streets, the BLM, the Antifa? Um, yeah, I think that's something we have to really be concerned about.
Yeah, it's interesting because the other one that I thought about was the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, that would be the ultimate poetic punishment for us for our own arrogance if we end up the way that our old rival ended up. But just the Soviet Union had collapsed, and you had one chunk of it that stayed together, and then you had all these little satellite things. I think if we were to break up the way that the Soviet Union did, I think the red states would be like Russia. We would probably stay together, and then the blue states would all break off into these chunks. But first of all, they're not contiguous geographically, so it would almost kind of be like that. So that's another kind of interesting parallel. What about your thoughts on the English Civil War? Because you're one of the few people I know who has studied the English Civil War. I was obsessed with it about March and April, and I was writing a lot about it. And I was reading all the Shakespeare plays, about the war, the different wars in England. I mean, this English Civil War happened after Shakespeare, but he did write a lot about the War of the Roses and the things that were the precursors to it. Do you think there's anything in the English Civil War that we can compare to our own time, especially the religious part of it?
Well, certainly within the strain of the parliamentarians, uh, you had a lot of fervently religious Puritans, gave rise to Cromwell and the New Model Army that gave Parliament its ultimate victory. So there is I would say that's one of the reasons I think there are so many people trying to discourage the church from fighting. It has historically, in the American Revolution, in the English Civil War, and then in the Glorious Revolution, it was people of faith that galvanized this stuff. Cromwell was a very passionate and religious man who led the Parliament to victory over an autocratic, divine right king. Uh, so I think that the church played such a significant role in that now we've had people who are determined to make sure the church is hamstrung and castrated from its manly type of role.
Right. Okay. Well, then the last thing I want to just ask you about is what's going to be the future relationship between us, the Southern Baptists who fought against the election fraud and who's held the line, and all of these people that we have walked alongside for so long, and we've had all this frustration with them. I'm talking about the Karen Swallow Pryors, the Beth Moores, the David Frenches, the Rod Dreyers, the Russell Moores, the Andrew Walkers, all those people. I mean, we've had to listen to their constant accusations about there being some grim GOP takeover for so long, and now I just feel like we've really crossed a bridge, and I don't think we can make this gap back up. Not after 2020. There was just too much nastiness. What will the future relationship be between us and the woke SBC? I mean, will it ever repair? Is there ever going to be any common ground there? Or are we basically just not going to be talking to each other? I don't feel like I can talk to them at this point right now because they're so far gone. In my mind, the last straw was when they're yelling at us because we're standing up to election fraud. That was the point where I was like, I can't reason with you because what you're saying is so, not only is it arrogant, not only is it callous, but it's so stupid. I mean, that's the thing, is it's just the stupidity. You just can't, that's what I feel like saying to some of these folks. I mean, you have a PhD, like, why are you being so dumb? So I don't know, what is the future between us and them, you think?
Light really doesn't have any fellowship with darkness, does it? I'm going to be honest. The people who are actively promoting this wokeism, it's heresy. It's or at least it's grave error, and it's attempting to deceive the public, deceive the church. I don't think there's a way back. People need to recant and revoke their teachings of this stuff, and then we can talk. Then you can have restoration. But as long as they persist in this error, and we know it's this godless ideology, it's attempting to divide people along racial lines when Christ unifies across racial lines. A focus on grievance politics, this is unhealthy, and it's horrible. So long term, I don't think there is a long term as long as people like that are allowed to have power.
Gosh, well, it's one thing I can bet. I think that you and I would both agree on 2021 is going to be an explosive year in the Southern Baptist Convention. So we'll have to see how that goes. So what should we do when these Christian nationalism things come up? Should we just ignore this and let it blow over, or do you think that we do need to actively be present and be debating over this, just on the odd chance that there are some passive observers who might be tempted to agree with these accusations that we're being Nazis by not accepting election fraud?
Challenge them. Demand, what's Christian nationalism? Demand the definition. Tell us what it is. Challenge the nonsense tweets that you run into. That's the only way, because they depend upon everybody just, oh, it's wonderful, and the little claps and likes that they get on social media. But people need to be called out once in a while on this stuff. I mean, demand a definition, because any definition they give of Christian nationalism, again, it's going to go back to basically arising out of something that comes from the SPLC or some other progressive liberal group. They're not going to have in general, in my experience, they don't really have good, solid, nonpartisan type definitions. It's a slur that they're kind of coming up to, kind of sort of like the alt-right. They want to target and pigeonhole anyone into these types of labels. Alt-right's no longer really a thing, so now it's Christian nationalism, because Christians are waking up and realizing America is something worth fighting for, and Christian principles should influence our patriotism and what we had tried to establish in America. So I would challenge them, particularly on this area, because they're going to have to show that nation states are not part of God's plan, and why being a patriot is a bad thing, and then also why our Christianity should not influence our government. I think that's an impossible task. So call them out for it.
Thank you so much. Your advice is very well appreciated. Where can people find you on the web? Capstone Report is your main hub, right?
Yeah,
but do you also want people to follow you on Twitter? It's Capstone Report is your Twitter handle, right?
Yep, that's where I'm at on Twitter, and there's Facebook page, same thing there. So, but yeah, most of our stuff, and I'm working on a column kind of on this same topic where we talk about Denny Burke, Karen Swallow Pryor, a lot of these people, Walker, their comments, David French. So I've been working on it. I wanted to get it posted today, but it hit 2,000 words, and I had to stop. And I'm like, I got to come back, reevaluate this and see if I can pare it down a little bit.
Well, I want to know whether I would love to publish your longer stuff, because you know so much history. I mean, I remember once talking to you about the War of the Spanish Succession, which honestly, I don't run into anyone who can get into a conversation on the War of the Spanish Succession. And you're like, I just read 3 books on Marlborough and all that. So I would just love to see like a lot of that in yours. But I understand for Capstone Report, you've got to make it, so that people can grab on to the information without having to look up stuff on Encyclopedia Britannica and things like that. But I hope that at some point I can publish some of your longer stuff. You can publish it on my blog, and that way, because my blog is like, no one reads my blog. My blog has like 5,000 word articles.
Well, history stuff is really my passion, particularly political history. If I could get in references to Henry Kissinger's writings and Churchill's writings, and I could probably go for 5,000 or 10,000 words about some random subject. But to me, it's fascinating, and I think there's a lot to be gleaned from history. History doesn't repeat, but it kind of teaches by analogy. I think that's what Kissinger said. So you need to study past events to kind of get an idea of what's happening now, because history is the memory of nations. So what we're going through right now is highly influenced by what we've gone through in the past, where we've come through. And I think that's one of the reasons education is so bad, they've tried to change the historical memory of what it means
Right.
to be an American citizen. They poisoned, what was it? Was it Zen's history, the U.S. history that has been so profound in rewriting it? And I think that's why we're here where we are. I think if you could look at the people who are in Southern Baptist seminaries, they've probably been more influenced by this type of negative anti-American history than actual history.
Well, I think that they're also assigned a lot of these, I would call them lifestyle books that are now very commonly assigned in Christian colleges that are just general things about some writer who talks about how to be a good Christian or how to live your life or how to find meaning in the world. I see some of the books that are assigned at some of these Christian colleges, and I'm just thinking to myself, this is such garbage. I mean, who was friends with the author and wanted to put them on the syllabus so that somebody would have to buy and read this stuff? And that is unfortunate. That is unfortunate. But for right now, for a lot of the articles that are out there, you're at capstonereport.com. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is rlopezmission, and my website is bobbylopez.me. And I will be back on the Big Brown Gadfly on Wednesday with John Zamirak. So I'm excited for that. I hope people can tune into that one, because I'm sure that the rapier-like wit of John Zamirak will spare nothing when we talk about this pro-fraud Christians, part 3 coming soon.
I'm looking forward to that. Thanks for having me on tonight. He had a great column just a few days ago about what servile Christians, and it's kind of where we are.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Thank you very much.
thanks. Have a good night.